raised by the TV and the streetlights. The psychology of Gen X's unsupervised childhood. There is a sound that lives permanently in the memory of a certain generation. The click of a key turning in a lock, in an empty house, in the middle of a weekday afternoon. No one else was home. No one else would be home for hours. And a child, 7 or 8 years old, would let himself in, set down his backpack, and quietly begin the business of raising himself for the rest of the day. This was not a rare or unusual childhood. For an entire generation of Gen X kids, it was simply Tuesday. It was simply how things were. Parents worked. Divorce rates climbed. The old neighborhood safety net, a mother home baking, a grandmother next door, an entire street of watchful adults had quietly dissolved, and in its place was a key on a string, a television for company, and a set of streetlights that served as the only curfew anyone bothered to enforce. The wise observer looks at this generation now, grown into adults in their 50s, and sees something the world rarely acknowledges. An entire cohort of people who were essentially raised by objects and environments rather than people. The television was the babysitter, the streetlights were the schedule. The silence of an empty house was the backdrop to childhood itself. And somehow, out of that strange and unsupervised upbringing, a very particular kind of adult emerged. He remembers, with startling clarity, the specific texture of that solitude, the hum of a television left on for company, even when nothing interesting was playing. The particular quality of afternoon light through kitchen curtains in a house with no one else in it, the sound of his own footsteps on empty stairs. These aren't traumatic memories, exactly, and this is important to say clearly, but they are formative ones, quiet ones, the kind that shape a nervous system without ever announcing themselves as significant. Consider what it actually requires of an 8-year-old to come home to an empty house every single day. He has to decide what to eat, and often make it himself. He has to entertain himself for hours, with no adult input, no structure, no one checking whether homework got done or whether he was safe. He has to self-soothe when something scary happens, a strange noise, a bad dream carried into daylight, a fear with no name, because there is, quite literally, no one else in the room to soothe him, and so he learns, far earlier than he should have to, that comfort is something he generates internally. No one is coming. He has to be his own rescue. This is the seed of an independence so deep, it eventually stops looking like independence at all and starts looking, simply, like personality. The wise observer wants to gently point out, it was never really a personality trait. It was a survival adaptation, built brick by brick out of thousands of ordinary, unremarkable afternoons alone. The streetlights deserve their own mention because they carried a strange kind of authority that no one else provided. When the streetlights came on, that was the signal to come home. Not a parent's voice calling from a porch, not a dinner bell, but simply the mechanical, indifferent glow of a municipal light fixture. An entire childhood, structured not by people who loved him, but by infrastructure. There's something almost poetic and almost sad about that, and the wise observer holds both truths at once without needing to resolve the tension between them. Because here is the thing that must be said plainly. This childhood, unsupervised as it was, also produced remarkable capability. The Gen X kid who let himself into an empty house became the adult who does not panic in a crisis, who can fix almost anything with minimal instruction, who navigates uncertainty with a calm that younger generations often find almost unsettling. That calm isn't coldness. It's competence, forged the hard way, at an age when it shouldn't have had to be forged at all. He grew into a person who is deeply, sometimes uncomfortably self-sufficient. He rarely asks for directions, for help moving furniture, for someone to sit with him through a hard week. Somewhere in the architecture of his mind, asking for help still carries a faint echo of that old truth. No one is coming, so best not to wait for them. This shows up in small ways that his family often mistakes for stubbornness, declining help, carrying groceries, insisting on driving himself to a medical appointment, quietly fixing a leak rather than calling anyone. There is also, often, a complicated relationship with silence and solitude, not fear of it, but a kind of fluency in it that other people don't share. Rooms that other people find lonely, he finds peaceful. An empty house, to him, doesn't register as sad. It registers as familiar, almost comfortable, the emotional equivalent of a language learned so early it no longer feels foreign. He remembers television differently than people from other generations do. It wasn't entertainment to him, not really, it was company. A specific sitcom rerun playing every afternoon becomes, decades later, an object of genuine emotional attachment, not because the show itself mattered, but because it was there when nothing else was. The wise observer notices how often this generation gets quietly emotional about old shows, old jingles, old theme songs, not nostalgia in the shallow sense, but something closer to gratitude toward the only steady presence available during long, unsupervised afternoons. His relationship to unstructured time is unusual too. He often struggles to simply relax, to do nothing, because unstructured time as a child meant time he alone had to fill, plan, and manage. Idle hours were never truly idle. They required a constant low hum of self-management. And so even now, decades removed from that empty house, sitting still without a task can feel oddly uncomfortable, like an old muscle memory insisting there must be something that needs handling. There's a particular tenderness, too, in how he treats his own children, if he has them. Many people from this generation became almost fiercely present parents, overcorrecting for the very absence that shaped them, showing up to every game, answering every call, refusing to let their own kids know the particular silence of an empty house at 3 p.m. This isn't discussed often, but the wise observer sees it clearly. An entire generation quietly rewriting its own childhood through the childhoods of the children who came after. And yet, some of the old patterns remain stubbornly intact even in the most attentive of these parents. He may struggle to ask his own children for help, may find it hard to be vulnerable even with people he raised himself to be close to him. The habits formed in an empty kitchen at age 8 do not simply vanish because life later filled up with people who love him. They soften, they loosen, but they rarely disappear completely. The wise observer wants to close on something important. This was not a childhood of neglect in the way that word often implies malice or cruelty. Most of the parents of this generation were doing the best they could inside a rapidly changing economy and a culture with no template yet for dual-income households or single parenting on this scale. No one set out to leave a generation of children alone with a television and a house key. It simply happened, quietly, across millions of households, and an entire generation absorbed the consequences without anyone fully realizing what was being built. There's a particular skill this generation developed that rarely gets named directly: the ability to read a house. Not literally, but emotionally, to walk into any room and instantly sense its temperature, its tension, its unspoken mood. This came from years of needing to assess, quickly and quietly, whether the empty house he was walking into was truly empty, whether everything was as it should be, whether anything needed his attention before anyone else even knew there was something to attend to. That same scanning instinct, developed in childhood hallways, now shows up in boardrooms, family gatherings, and quiet dinners, a background process that never fully switched off. Money, too, carries an unusual weight for this generation. Many of them handled small amounts of cash and responsibility far earlier than their peers in other eras. Bus fare, lunch money, spare keys, small emergencies solved without an adult present to consult. That early handling of responsibility, small as it seems, wired something durable. A belief that competence has to be self-generated, that waiting for someone else to handle a problem is, at best, an unreliable strategy. It's part of why so many from this generation became notably careful, sometimes even anxious, about financial security later in life, not from greed, but from an old, deep memory of managing things alone that were technically too big for a child to manage. Their relationship with authority figures often carries a quiet skepticism, too, not rebellion exactly, but a learned distance. When the adults who were supposed to be present so often weren't, a child learns not to fully outsource his sense of safety to any external structure. institutional or otherwise. This shows up later as a certain self-directed quality at work, a mild discomfort with micromanagement, a preference for being trusted to simply get things done without someone standing over his shoulder confirming it. He was, after all, his own supervisor from a very young age, and some part of him never fully relinquished that role. There is also a distinct sensory memory this generation carries: the specific smell of a house in late afternoon before anyone else came home, sunlight through dusty blinds, the low mechanical hum of an old refrigerator. These sensory fragments surface unexpectedly even now, decades later, triggered by a smell or a certain slant of light, pulling him instantly back to a childhood kitchen where he was, in every meaningful sense, the only adult in the room, quietly managing a life that was, in every practical sense, entirely his own. It's worth noting, too, how this generation relates to food often in small, telling ways. Many of them can still describe, in exact detail, the specific snack combinations they invented alone in empty kitchens, the particular way they learned to make a sandwich, the cereal eaten dry because there was no one to pour milk that hadn't gone bad, the frozen dinner, mastered in a microwave before most kids their age had ever operated one unsupervised. These aren't dramatic memories. They're mundane, almost funny in hindsight, but they represent thousands of small moments of a child quietly deciding, again and again, that he could take care of himself. The wise observer also wants to name something tender here: how deeply this generation values genuine, unscheduled connection precisely because they had so little structured connection as children. A phone call that isn't about logistics, a friend who simply shows up, a partner who notices without needing to be told. These moments land with unusual weight for someone who spent so many afternoons with only a television for company, not because he is needy, but because he has never stopped quietly, privately appreciating presence in a way that people who always had it around simply take for granted. There is one more thing worth understanding about this generation's relationship to time itself. Because so much of childhood involved waiting for a parent's car in the driveway, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the particular sound of a key that meant he was no longer alone, many of them developed an unusually precise internal clock. They know, almost instinctively, how long 5 minutes actually feels. They rarely check a watch to know it's nearly time for something. Some old part of them has simply always been counting. This precision, born from years of watching a clock in an empty house, quietly became one of their most reliable and least celebrated skills. What was built, in the end, deserves both compassion and respect. A generation raised by televisions and streetlights became one of the most quietly resilient generations in modern memory. Capable, self-contained, uncomplaining, fluent in solitude in a way that later generations, raised with constant supervision and constant connectivity, may never fully understand. It came at a cost. It also produced something genuinely remarkable. And the wise observer believes both of those truths deserve to be spoken gently, together, because a child who raised himself in an empty house grew into an adult who never stopped quietly, capably, holding everything together, long after the streetlights simply became a memory of the last true curfew he ever needed. And perhaps the most generous thing anyone can offer him now is simply this: to see the empty house not as an absence to pity, but as the quiet, unlikely place where something remarkably strong was built. There is a final image worth holding on to, one that captures this generation more honestly than any statistic could. Picture a porch light left on for no one in particular, glowing quietly into an empty street long after the last car has passed. That is, in many ways, exactly who this generation became: a steady, unglamorous presence, illuminating the way for others without ever expecting anyone to notice or thank them for it. They learned early that light doesn't need an audience to matter, it simply needs to stay on. And so they kept it on, for their own children, for their friends, for anyone who ever needed a quiet, dependable glow in the dark. The empty house eventually filled with people, filled slowly, imperfectly, over years of showing up in the only ways he knew how. But somewhere underneath all of it, quiet and steady and almost entirely unnoticed by anyone around him, that same small porch light, the very one from a long ago quiet childhood, never really went out at all, even now.